Shalom, my friend. You asked for more, you planned for more, you worked for more, and then more arrived, and something broke, not on the outside, not immediately, but you felt it. The pressure shifted. The clarity you once had started to blur. Decisions that used to feel simple started costing you sleep. Relationships that were solid started showing tension lines, and the income you gained somehow produced less peace than the income you had before. That is not a spiritual crisis. That is a structural one. And today we are going to diagnose exactly what happened and why it keeps happening to people who are doing everything right. Today is episode 44, The Expansion Law. Why growth collapses. Stay with me through this entire video, because what I am going to show you is not motivational. It is not theological in the soft sense. It is architectural. It is structural. It is the reason that some people grow and remain stable, and other people grow and fall apart. And once you understand it, you will never look at your ambition the same way again. Let us begin. You are not failing because you lack desire. You are not collapsing because you lack faith. You're not stalling because God is withholding from you. You're experiencing structural overload because you received more than your current architecture could contain. That is the diagnosis. That is the whole diagnosis. Everything else we talk about today is just understanding the mechanism behind that one sentence. Here is the fundamental law that governs everything in this conversation. Expansion without increased capacity causes collapse, because this single law explains more human failure than almost anything else I could name. Now let me be precise about two words I'm going to use repeatedly, because most people confuse them, and the confusion is what makes the problem invisible until it is too late. The two words are momentum and capacity. Momentum is speed. It is movement. It is the rate at which you are gaining ground, adding income, growing influence, acquiring territory. Momentum feels like progress, and it is progress. But it is only one dimension of progress. It is the horizontal dimension. Capacity is structure. It is the internal architecture that determines how much you can actually hold without fracturing. Capacity is your systems, your relational infrastructure, your psychological bandwidth, your physical health, your organizational frameworks, your leadership structure. Capacity is vertical. It is depth. And depth is what makes movement sustainable. Here is the problem that destroys builders. Momentum is visible. Capacity is invisible. You can see your income going up. You can see your follower count increasing. You can see your business acquiring new clients. You can see your territory expanding. But you cannot see whether your internal structure can hold what is coming. And because momentum is visible and exciting and socially celebrated, most people chase it aggressively. And because capacity is invisible and structural and largely unseen, most people neglect it systematically. And then the collapse comes, and they call it bad luck, or spiritual attack, or betrayal. But what actually happened was structural overload. They built speed without depth. They gained momentum without capacity. And when the weight of the expansion exceeded what the structure could hold, things started to fracture. Let me make this concrete, not theoretical, real. Think about the man who worked 10 years in a company. He was stable. His marriage was functional. His health was manageable. His finances were tight but contained. And then he received a major promotion. New title, new salary, new scope of responsibility, new team to manage, new decisions to make, new visibility in the organization. From the outside, everything looked like blessing, and in many ways it was. The income was real, the opportunity was real, But here is what also became real very quickly. He now had 30% more income and 60% more demand on his time. He had a team to lead, but no leadership framework in place. He had a larger platform, but no systems for managing the information flow. He had more money but no upgraded financial infrastructure to contain it well. His wife, who had been his partner through the lean years, now saw him less, heard from him less, and felt his emotional availability drop to near zero. Within 18 months, the promotion that looked like expansion had produced a marriage under severe strain, a health situation that had deteriorated significantly because rest had been sacrificed on the altar of performance, a team that was underperforming because he had no real leadership architecture in place, and a financial picture that, despite higher income, had actually become more chaotic, not less. That is not bad luck. That is structural overload. He received expansion before his capacity was sufficient to hold it. The vessel cracked under the weight. And here is the part that is hardest to hear. He qualified for that promotion, and it still broke things. Because the problem was never the expansion. The problem was the absence of the infrastructure required to contain the expansion. This is the law, and it is not punitive. It is mechanical. A vessel that cannot hold the volume it receives will leak or break. That is not a judgment. That is a physical reality. And human beings operate under the same structural law. Now, I want to take you to a place in Torah that most people read as a promise, but almost never read as a structural principle. And it is one of the most important structural principles in the entire text. Exodus chapter 23, verse 30. This is God speaking about the inheritance of the promised land. And he says this, "Little by little I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and inherited the land." God is not releasing the territory gradually because he cannot release it all at once. He is releasing it gradually because the people cannot contain it all at once. He says it directly, until you have increased. The territory release is calibrated to the capacity of the vessel. The expansion is governed by the preparedness of the structure that will hold it. And then look at the verse just before this one, verse 29. God says he will not drive them out in a single year, lest the land become desolate and the wild animals multiply against you. In other words, if you receive the territory before you have the population density, the organizational structure, the agricultural systems, and the defensive capacity to manage it, the very territory you gained will work against you. The emptiness of the uncultivated land will become dangerous. The expansion will produce instability rather than security. This is not metaphor. This is structural architecture. God is describing a release protocol that is calibrated to capacity. Expansion is sequenced to match the vessel's ability to hold it without fracturing. Little by little is not a consolation prize for people who cannot get it all at once. Little by little is the architecture of sustainable growth. It is the design, and it is the design not because of limitation, but because of wisdom. Because wisdom understands that an expansion that exceeds capacity does not produce dominion. It produces chaos. Now let me bring you a man from history who understood this so precisely that his kingdom became the standard against which all subsequent leadership was measured. I am talking about Solomon. And I want you to hear me carefully here, because Solomon is almost always presented through a devotional lens. The wise king, the man who asked for wisdom, the builder of the temple, temple, and while all of that is true, it is the least useful way to understand Solomon if what you are trying to do is build. The useful way to understand Solomon is this: he was the most sophisticated administrator, infrastructure builder, and systems architect in the ancient world. His greatness was not mystical, it was structural. Look at what Solomon did before he expanded. 1 Kings chapter 4 describes his administrative organization with extraordinary specificity. He divided the entire kingdom into 12 administrative districts. Each district had a governor responsible for supplying provisions for the royal household on a rotating monthly basis. This was not ceremonial. This was a logistics and supply chain operation of extraordinary complexity. He solved the problem of feeding a large royal court and a standing army by distributing the burden across a managed network of accountable governors with defined territories and defined obligations. 1 Kings chapter 9 describes the storage cities he built, cities specifically designed as infrastructure nodes, not population centers, not military fortresses primarily, storage cities, infrastructure designed to hold supply, to buffer against shortage, to create the slack in the system that prevents operational fragility. Solomon understood that an empire without storage capacity is one disruption away from crisis. So before he expanded his influence, he built the containers. His cedar and stone procurement systems involved international agreements with Hiram of Tyre, defined payment structures, organized labor forces with rotating schedules, and a managed supply chain that kept a massive construction project operational for years without collapsing. That is not wisdom in the abstract sense. That is operational excellence. That is infrastructure mastery. And what was the result of all this infrastructure building? Only after the systems were in place, only after the administrative districts were organized, only after the storage cities were built, only after the governance frameworks were operational, did Solomon expand his sphere of influence to a scale that had never existed before in Israel's history. Nations sent delegations to him. International trade agreements were formalized. The kingdom's reach extended from the Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. The expansion was massive, but it was stable because the capacity had been built before the expansion arrived. The vessel was prepared before the volume was released. That is the Solomon model. Build the infrastructure, organize the administration, create the storage systems, establish the governance framework, and then, and only then, allow the expansion to fill the space you have prepared. Now let me translate all of this directly into your life, because this is where theory has to become diagnosis. And diagnosis only works if it is specific. Let us talk about money first, because money is where this law is most immediately visible. When someone's income increases significantly and their peace decreases simultaneously, that is not ingratitude. That is structural overload. What happened is that the income expanded, but the financial infrastructure did not expand at the same rate. There is no budget architecture that can contain the new income intelligently. There is no clear allocation system for the increased cash flow. There is no tax strategy in place to manage the additional complexity. There is no investment framework that has been thought through and implemented. There is no spending boundary that has been renegotiated as income has changed. So the money arrives, and instead of being captured and directed by a system, it flows through the fingers. And the anxiety increases because now there is more to lose and no clear structure for protecting it. Solomon built storage cities before he expanded. The financial parallel is this: before income increases significantly, build the infrastructure to hold it, the budget architecture, the allocation system, the protection strategy, the governance framework for your money. Build the container before you receive the volume. If you receive the volume without the container, the expansion produces chaos rather than stability. This is also why lottery winners so frequently end up worse off within 5 years than they were before the winnings. Not because money is dangerous, because the sudden massive increase in financial volume exceeded the capacity of every infrastructure system that person had in place. The relational container could not hold the new dynamics. The decision-making structure had no framework for the new complexity. The psychological architecture had not been built for this level of resource management, and so the vessel cracked. Not because blessing arrived, because the vessel was not prepared for what blessing required. Now, let us talk about marriage, because this is where premature expansion does the most silent, sustained damage. I hear from people all the time who say, "I achieved what I was working toward, and my marriage suffered." And they say it with genuine confusion, as if success and marital stability should naturally coexist. And they can, but only if the relational architecture is upgraded alongside the external growth. Here is what actually happens in most cases. One partner achieves a significant external expansion. Income, influence, responsibility, social status, recognition. Their world gets larger. Their demands get larger. Their time budget shifts dramatically, and the marriage, which was built for and calibrated to the previous version of the partner's life, has not been structurally upgraded to accommodate the new reality. The relational container that was sufficient for a man who was home by 6 and had weekends available is not automatically sufficient for a man who is traveling 3 weeks out of 4 and carrying organizational stress that he has not learned to put down when he walks through the door. The relational infrastructure has to be intentionally rebuilt, renegotiated, and expanded to match the new circumstances. If it is not, the expansion of one partner's external world produces contraction in the shared relational world. This is why so many people reach the peak of their professional achievement and find themselves alone in a marriage, not because their spouse failed them, not primarily, but because the relational capacity was never upgraded to match the expansion. The container stayed the same size, while the life inside it got dramatically larger. The structural question a builder must ask before every significant external expansion is this: does my relational infrastructure have the capacity to hold what this expansion will require? If the honest answer is no, then building the relational infrastructure is not optional. It is prerequisite. Expansion without increased relational capacity fractures relationships. It is law. Now let us talk about leadership and business, because this is where I see the most dramatic structural collapses, and also where the pattern is most clearly visible once you know what to look for. A business scales, revenue increases, customer volume increases, team size increases, visibility increases, and then the founder starts to feel a kind of chronic overwhelm that did not exist at smaller scale, not the productive pressure of someone working hard, the disorienting overwhelm of someone who is trying to hold more than their current architecture can contain. What happened? The business expanded faster than the governance systems. The revenue grew faster than the financial controls. The team grew faster than the leadership infrastructure. The customer volume grew faster than the operational systems. In other words, momentum outpaced capacity. Speed exceeded structure. And now the founder is running as fast as they can just to keep the expanding organism from breaking apart. Solomon did not run his kingdom like that. He built the administrative districts before the kingdom reached full size. He installed the governance systems before the expansion required them to work at full load. He created the infrastructure during the building phase, not after the collapse phase. He solved tomorrow's structural problems today, while today's scale still left margin for solving them. This is what strategic builders do. They look ahead at the size they are moving toward, and they ask, what governance systems, what organizational infrastructure, what leadership architecture will that size require? And then they build those systems now at current scale, where the pressure of solving them is lower and the margin for experimentation is higher. If you wait until the expansion is fully upon you to build the infrastructure the expansion requires, you will always be behind. You will always be reactive. You will always be in crisis management mode rather than governance mode, because you are trying to build the container while it is already over full. Let us talk about health, because this one is the most predictable and the most consistently underestimated. When a person enters a phase of significant expansion in their external life, the first thing they sacrifice is almost always their physical health. Sleep gets reduced, exercise gets eliminated, nutrition degrades, recovery time disappears, and the reasoning sounds logical. There is simply not enough time for all of it right now. Once things stabilize, I will return to taking care of myself. But here's the structural reality. Your body is the primary vessel. It is the foundational container. Without physical capacity, every other system degrades. Cognitive performance drops. Emotional regulation decreases. Decision quality deteriorates, relational presence diminishes, leadership effectiveness erodes. Every single output you are trying to increase through your expansion is compromised when the physical vessel is under capacity. There's no version of sustainable expansion that does not include physical infrastructure maintenance. None. A founder who is sleeping 4 hours a night to manage an expanding business is not building capacity. They are borrowing against the future structural integrity of the vessel that everything else depends on. And that debt will come due. The debt accumulates, and it will surface. It comes as a health crisis, a mental break, a relational collapse, to all three simultaneously. Solomon did not sacrifice the foundational infrastructure to fund the expansion of everything else. He built everything in the right sequence: the temple, the administrative systems, the storage cities, the governance framework, each layer supporting the next, each foundation prepared before the next level was added, because he understood structurally what most modern builders do not. You cannot build on a crumbling foundation and expect the structure above it to stand. Now, I want to say something about pauses, because most people experience pauses in their growth as punishment or withdrawal, and I want to restructure how you understand that. When growth slows or stops, the common interpretation is that something has gone wrong. There has been a failure. There has been a withdrawal of favor. There has been an attack. There has been a mistake. And sometimes those things are true. But very frequently, what has actually happened is that the expansion has outpaced the capacity of the vessel, and the pause is a structural response to an overload condition. Growth withdraws when capacity is exceeded. That is the law. And it is not punitive, it is preservational, because if the expansion continued beyond the vessel's capacity to hold it, the collapse would be catastrophic rather than correctable. A builder who understands this does not spend the pause in panic or prayer for the expansion to resume. They spend the pause in a capacity audit. They ask, what broke? What weakened? Where did the structure fail? What systems are absent that need to be built? What infrastructure is insufficient that needs to be upgraded? What capacity needs to be developed before the next phase of expansion can be safely held? The pause is an invitation to build capacity. And if you use it that way, you exit the pause stronger than you entered it, with a structure that can actually hold the next level of expansion without fracturing. But if you spend the pause in anxiety and complaint and theological confusion, you exit the pause at the same capacity you entered it. And the next expansion will produce the same collapse it produced the last time, because the structure that failed has not been rebuilt. Expansion pauses when structure cannot sustain it. Strengthen the vessel. Now I want to give you a specific tool, not a concept, a tool, something you can actually use starting today. I call it the Vessel Inspection Protocol, and it is exactly what it sounds like. A vessel inspection is a structural audit of your current capacity across the primary domains of your life, not an emotional check-in, not a gratitude exercise, a structural inspection. The same way an engineer inspects a bridge before increasing the load it carries, you need to inspect your structural capacity before the next phase of expansion arrives or before you pursue it. The inspection has 5 primary domains: financial infrastructure, relational architecture, physical capacity, organizational systems, and psychological bandwidth. In the financial domain, you are asking specific questions. Do I have a budget architecture that can contain my current income and a significantly increased income intelligently? Do I have an allocation system? Do I have a protection strategy? Do I have the accounting infrastructure to manage my financial complexity? Do I have the tax framework in place? If your income were to double tomorrow, would your financial systems be able to hold that expansion without fracturing? In the relational domain, is my marriage structurally equipped for the demands that the next level of my expansion will place on my time, my emotional availability, my physical presence? Have my partner and I explicitly renegotiated our relational infrastructure as my external responsibilities have grown? Are there active structural cracks in my closest relationships that have not been addressed? Because an unaddressed structural crack in the relational foundation becomes a catastrophic failure under the additional weight of expansion. In the physical domain, is my sleep architecture in place? Is my physical maintenance system operational? Am I maintaining the vessel that everything else runs through? Or am I depleting it in order to fund the expansion? Because you cannot borrow from the foundational vessel indefinitely without catastrophic structural consequences. In the organizational domain, do I have governance systems that can manage my current scale and my next scale? Do I have delegation infrastructure? Do I have decision frameworks? Do I have accountability systems? Do I have the administrative architecture to actually manage what I am building? Or am I holding everything in my head and hoping memory and willpower are sufficient? And in the psychological domain, what is my current stress threshold? What is my decision fatigue level? Do I have adequate recovery systems in place? Do I have the mental and emotional bandwidth to lead at the next level of expansion? Or am I already at or near the ceiling of what my current psychological infrastructure can manage? If you cannot identify where your vessel is cracking, expansion will destroy what you just built. That is not a warning designed to frighten you. It is a structural fact. And the vessel inspection protocol exists to give you the diagnostic clarity to see the cracks before they become catastrophic failures. If you need help working through this inspection with structure, the vessel inspection protocol is available as a guided diagnostic tool. It walks you through each domain with the specific questions and the specific metrics that reveal where your capacity is sufficient and where it needs to be strengthened. This is not a motivational guide. It is a structural tool. If you intend to expand, inspection precedes expansion. The link is available below this video. Use it before the next expansion arrives, not after it collapses. Now let me give you the full architectural picture before we close, because I want this to be clear in your mind as a complete framework, not a collection of separate ideas. Structure determines what expansion can be held, not desire, not prayer, not ambition, not even effort. Structure. The vessel that you have built determines the volume it can contain, and no amount of spiritual fervor changes that mechanical reality. Faith without structure is not faith, it is wish. And wishes do not build empires. Solomon did not wish for his kingdom. He architected it. He organized it. He built the governance systems. He established the administrative infrastructure. He created the storage capacity. He solved the logistics of supply and distribution. And then the expansion arrived and stayed because the structure was prepared to hold it. Exodus 23:30 is not a promise for the impatient. It is a design specification for the intelligent. Little by little is the architecture of sustainable growth. It is the sequencing protocol that preserves the integrity of the vessel while increasing its capacity to hold more. When God said little by little, he was describing a process of synchronized expansion and capacity development. Each expansion matched to capacity, each release of territory calibrated to the preparedness of the people to govern it. That is the model, not rapid acquisition followed by structural collapse. Synchronized capacity development and expansion, each supporting the other, each preparing for the next phase, each building on the foundation that precedes it. And if you have already experienced the collapse, if you have already felt the weight of an expansion that exceeded your capacity, if you are living in the aftermath of growth that fractured the structure it was supposed to strengthen, that is not a verdict. That is a diagnosis, and a diagnosis is the beginning of the rebuild, not the end of the story. The rebuild begins with an honest inspection of what failed and why. It begins with a clear understanding of the structural law that was violated. It begins with a commitment to build capacity before pursuing the next phase of expansion. And it begins with the intelligence to understand that the pause, the slowdown, the withdrawal of momentum is not punishment. It is preservation. It is the structural reality of a system that cannot safely carry more until more has been built into the vessel. Use the pause. Inspect the vessel. Strengthen what is weak. Rebuild what fractured. And prepare the infrastructure for the expansion that is coming. Now I want to give you something to carry forward into the next episode, because what we covered today is the foundational law, the expansion law, the principle that structure determines what growth can be held. But there is a specific failure mode that comes immediately after the expansion phase that destroys more of what has been built than almost anything else we could name. In episode 45, we are going to examine the Rehoboam collapse, and what you will see there is a case study in what happens when expansion survives the first phase, but then fails catastrophically in the governance phase that follows. Because Rehoboam inherited a kingdom that Solomon had built with extraordinary structural sophistication, and within the first week of his leadership, He made a single governance decision that split the entire kingdom in two. Not because the kingdom was weak, but because the new leader failed the delegation test, and it destroyed in days what had taken decades to build. The next structural law reveals why delegation determines whether expansion survives. And if you are building anything of significance, you cannot afford to miss that episode. Before we close, I want to say this directly to you, not as encouragement, as structural truth. Ambition without structure collapses. Expansion without capacity fractures. Desire without architecture destabilizes. Build the vessel, then expand. Your soul is the blueprint. Your life is the construction. Shalom, my friend. Now let's build the life God designed for you.